Hey, this is Jamey from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my favorite mechanisms in the game Empire of the Stars. This is kind of a space opera style game that reminded me a lot of other space opera games, but I think the game has some really interesting, unique mechanisms that make it a little bit more streamlined than I would normally expect from this style of game. I like that a lot. The first is, and this is probably my favorite mechanism in the game, so I'll jump right to it, is the action selection. So this game essentially uses an action checklist, but it does so in a way that I really like. You probably heard me talk on this channel about how I generally don't like action checklists, but I like when they're implemented in ways that add a puzzle that either adds interaction between you and other players or adds a puzzle for yourself to figure out, maybe a spatial puzzle or a turn order puzzle. And in this case, it's on the board here. So you have this giant game board. It's double-sided, but this is the side that I thought was really clever to play on, because out here around the middle of the board are all these different places where you're placing planets, you're developing your empire. But in the middle of the board is the action selection system. And so you have this giant token here, and you will choose an action somewhere in this area, but there's a movement element to it. So for example, if the token is right here, if it's on the engineer action, I can't choose the engineer action. Instead, I need to move it away from the engineer action. I can move it one space for free. So I can move it one space and choose the steward action. And then when I do that, I get to take the steward action with a little bonus, and then every other player also gets to take the steward action. You've seen mechanisms like this in Race for the Galaxy, Roll for the Galaxy, that type of thing. Or I can pay $1 and put that dollar on the steward for the next player who uses steward to actually gain that dollar and move to the next space, or so on. And so I could move... Hopefully that was too loud on the mic. I could move pretty far away from the original action if I'm willing to pay for it. But I really like this spatial element here. Not only is it spatial for me, but it's spatial for the other players as well, because as I move around, I am determining the easy actions for the next player to take, and I'm even essentially incentivizing them to maybe take certain actions. If I do put that dollar on Steward and I go over to Warlord, then the next player might want to go back to Steward and get that action and get that dollar, and I get that action as well. They just get a better version of it. I think that's a really clever action selection system in this game. The other two things I thought were really, really clever. One is there's an action you can take. I just closed up the board, but it is... I don't know, there's an action in the game that kind of determines essentially the end of the round. And actually, you don't even need to take an action to do this. But at a certain point in the game, if you take a related action, there's a player who will get to choose an edict. And the edict, this is just one example of one of the many edicts in the game. They essentially get to choose a rule that impacts all players. And this rule triggers at the end of each round. So this is Netocracy. This one says all players score 1 colony token, and the player with the most far space locations scores 1 galaxy token. Colony tokens and galaxy tokens are points in this game. But I like games where one player gets to choose a rule at certain times that impacts everyone at the table. And this was done in a really, really simple and streamlined way where it feels good to get this tile. You'll probably choose this at a time that benefits you the most. But by the end of the round, it might also have benefit someone else a little bit more. But it also doesn't give players a lot to think about, which is nice. You're not learning this whole other rule that you have to remember for just that round. It's just a little thing, little incentive. So the player with the most far space locations, that's the thing to remember for this round. The last thing that I thought was really clever is the game moves, there's a reason the game moves at a quick pace, and that is that many of the actions, and including the end of the round action, gets players to score colony tokens. So that means they're removing these little tokens from their player mat, and the game ends when a player has no colony tokens on their player mat. But I just liked that from the very beginning of the game, like it wasn't one of these games where you're kind of waiting and waiting and waiting for the scoring to start happen if scoring is tied to the end game condition. Rather, players are constantly and actively removing those colony tokens from their player mat. It feels good to do so because they are points, and it also just happens frequently. And so you constantly feel like the timer is ticking down. And I think that's I generally think that's a good idea in this style of game, that you have this sense of urgency to get things done now, even though there's plenty of time to do that, but you have the sense of a ticking timer to get things done. And it's also nice for me where I don't want to sit down and play a 3 to 5 hour space opera style game that when I saw that timer ticking down, I was like, okay, this is actually moving along at a pretty quick pace here. I need to get going. I don't have time to develop this empire if I don't actually start developing this empire. Yeah, I don't know. I just really liked how the game moved forward at a pretty brisk pace thanks to that timer. Those are my thoughts on Empire of the Stars. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below if you've played it, or if any of these mechanisms that I've described remind you of another game with similar mechanisms. Thanks.